In the biting cold of winter 1809 Albany, New York was already a city of contrasts, its proud brick streets lined with prosperous merchants, yet its outskirts still haunted by wilderness, superstition, and shadows of a war not long ended. On one such edge stood a farmhouse, unremarkable at first glance, its wooden beams weathered, its fields long abandoned. But beneath those boards lay something that would transform the house from a forgotten relic into one of the most chilling mysteries in American history. During routine renovations, workers stumbled upon a trapdoor sealed with corroded iron. When the hinges finally gave way, what emerged was not dust or storage, but a chamber carved in stone, suffocatingly narrow, reeking of rot and damp. And inside, 12 skeletons. Each one was bound by thick iron chains, their bones slumped in silent agony against the walls. No official record explained who they were. No parish had documented a dozen missing souls. No family ever arrived to claim them. The man once tied to the house, Samuel Whitlock, a respected merchant and Revolutionary War veteran, was already dead, his reputation cloaked in reverence. The community had praised his charity, his donations during bitter winters, his sermons about purity and faith. Yet here, in the darkness of his cellar, lay evidence of something irreconcilable with his public image. Whispers spread swiftly, carried by the snow-laden winds. Villagers claimed the bones made a faint hum when disturbed, as if their silence still vibrated with unfinished cries. Priests framed the discovery as divine punishment, a warning of sins festering beneath the surface of righteous men. Doctors, though less superstitious, could not ignore the skeletal evidence, signs of prolonged confinement, malnutrition, fractures that spoke of restraint. Was this basement a clandestine prison? The hidden chamber of a man whose generosity was only a mask? Or was it something older, a site chosen for reasons darker than any one man's cruelty? Folklore offered a chilling possibility, that Whitlock had built his home atop cursed ground, once used as a burial pit during the plague. If true, then the chains might not have been punishment, but ritual, iron bindings meant to silence restless dead. Here fact collided with myth, and neither prevailed. Was this crime, curse, or both? The line blurred, and in that blurred space, fear thrived. The farmhouse became more than a building. It became a question that history has never answered. 12 skeletons, 12 chains, 12 stories that could never speak for themselves. All that remained was the silence, and the uneasy feeling that silence was not the absence of sound, but the echo of something humanity had chosen to forget. And so the mystery begins. A farmhouse, a trapdoor, and 12 voices shackled forever in the dark. The farmhouse on the outskirts of Albany was more than timber and stone. It was the physical embodiment of a man who lived a life divided between public admiration and private obsession. Built in 1783, at the dawn of America's fragile independence, it carried the weight of its founder's name, Samuel Whitlock. To most who lived in Albany at the time, Whitlock was a patriot, a survivor of the Revolutionary War who had returned home with scars both visible and invisible. His right leg bore a jagged wound from musket fire at Saratoga, forcing him to walk with a stiff, uneven gait. His left hand carried the remnants of a burn, charred from the blast of cannon fire. He was a man shaped by war, both hardened and, according to the sermons he would later deliver, purified by suffering. When Whitlock re-entered civilian life, he used the modest fortune he had acquired as a merchant to purchase land outside the bustling town center. On that land, he constructed a home that seemed designed to impress both friend and stranger. The farmhouse, though not grand by the standards of Albany's wealthiest families, stood taller than most with its sturdy frame, red shutters, and fields that stretched wide toward the forest. Villagers admired the sight of it from afar, a symbol of resilience, a soldier's return, and a community benefactor's promise. Indeed, Whitlock did not squander the goodwill he had earned on the battlefield. In the first harsh winter after his house was built, he distributed sacks of grain and bundles of wood to families whose stores had run empty. Mothers praised him, fathers tipped their hats in gratitude, and the church recognized his donations with warm public acknowledgement. His name was soon synonymous with charity, and his reputation, cemented in the official record, was one of honor. Yet even in those early years, whispers followed him. Neighbors noted his peculiar habits, the way he avoided town gatherings except when required, the way he lingered on sermons of fire and judgment, the way he would vanish into his cellar at night, carrying candles and heavy books, sometimes joined by unknown men cloaked in black. To the community, these were eccentricities, perhaps the residue of war trauma. To those who watched more closely, however, they were signs of something else, a hunger, an obsession, a darkness that no victory could wash away. Samuel Whitlock's journals, fragments of which survive in Albany's historical archives, offer glimpses into that hidden life. Written in a heavy hand, they speak of purity of the soul, of chains that bind the impure spirit, and of walls that must hold silence until judgment. The words are cryptic, yet they echo with themes that villagers would later recall in his fiery speeches, sermons he gave not in church, but in the privacy of his home, to small gatherings of men who never stayed long enough to be recognized. Some speculated that these were veterans, fellow soldiers seeking solace in Scripture. Others believed them to be part of a secret society, bound not by prayer but by ritual. The house itself reflected this duality. Above ground, its rooms were open and warm, with wide hearths and polished wood floors that glowed in candlelight. Visitors remarked on its orderliness, the way Whitlock's shelves were stacked with books, the way his dining table always seemed set for more than one. But below ground, through a narrow staircase that twisted steeply downward, lay a basement unlike any in the area. Most basements in Albany were simple storage rooms, filled with barrels of apples, salted meat, or preserved vegetables. Whitlock's, however, was built of reinforced stone, its walls thick, its ceiling low, its air unnaturally still. There was only one entrance, a door of iron hinges so heavy it groaned whenever opened. Why would a man known for generosity construct such a space? Some argued it was practical, a stronghold against potential raids, a storage for valuables in a time when theft was common. Others wondered if it was meant as a sanctuary, a place of solitude where he could escape the world above. But later generations would question whether it was built for something far darker, a dungeon designed not to preserve life, but to contain it. Town records present a jarring contrast. On one hand, church documents praise Whitlock for his donations, calling him a pillar of faith and protector of the community. On the other hand, county records from the 1790s mention missing travelers along the Albany-Hudson route. Their disappearances were attributed to wolves, highwaymen, or accidents in the wilderness. But villagers whispered a different story, that Whitlock's land was cursed ground, that strangers who wandered too close to his property never returned. One tale, passed down through generations, described a young peddler who came knocking on Whitlock's door one autumn evening. He was never seen again, though his cart was found abandoned near the edge of Whitlock's field. Another rumor spoke of a farmhand who had been hired for a season, only to vanish without warning. His family, desperate for answers, was told by Whitlock himself that the boy had moved on to better prospects. No one could prove otherwise. And yet, without evidence, the whispers remained whispers. People wanted to believe in Whitlock's charity more than they feared his secrecy. After all, who would question the hand that fed them in times of need? The duality of his life, public benefactor, private recluse, created a veil of contradiction that no one dared pierce. Still, the basement loomed in the imagination of those who lived nearby. Children dared each other to approach the house, swearing they heard muffled sounds from beneath the earth, banging, scratching, sometimes even cries that faded into the night air. Whitlock himself spoke often of silence, preaching that true purity could only be found in stillness, that noise was the mark of sin, and that the soul could only ascend when its voice was quieted. These were words that unsettled the few who heard them, for they sounded less like comfort and more like command. By the time of his death in 1804, Whitlock had secured his place as a man of paradox. His will left small sums to the church and donations to widows, further polishing his image as a charitable figure. Yet those who had seen the late-night gatherings, who had passed his property and felt the weight of unseen eyes, carried a different memory. They remembered the smell of smoke rising at odd hours, the flickering of lanterns through cracks in the floorboards, and the sight of Whitlock's uneven gait disappearing into the cellar, never re-emerging until dawn. The house he left behind bore the mark of his contradictions. Above ground it was orderly, almost pristine. Below ground it was heavy with secrets. The reinforced stone basement, with its single narrow entrance, became the most enduring symbol of his legacy. Was it storage, sanctuary, or prison? The answer remained hidden, sealed away until the trapdoor was pried open in 1809, revealing horrors that forever reframed the man once known as a benefactor. Whitlock's story embodies the uneasy balance between what is seen and what is hidden. On the surface, he was a patriot, a merchant, a neighbor whose charity kept families alive. Beneath the surface, literally and figuratively, he was something else entirely, a man whose obsessions carved a chamber of stone that would outlive him, a chamber that would later expose the silence he left behind. It is here, in the story of the house and its founder, that the origins of the curse begin. not merely in the bones discovered decades later, but in the life of the man who built the walls that contained them. A man who spoke of purity, yet whose legacy reeks of corruption. A man who preached silence, yet whose silence became an eternal echo. Patriot or predator, benefactor or jailer, hero of the revolution, or architect of the unspoken horrors chained beneath his floorboards. The farmhouse itself offers no answers. Only the cellar remains, standing as Whitlock's most enduring sermon, a sermon written not in words but in stone and silence. By 1795, the story of Samuel Whitlock and his farmhouse had already begun to drift away from the neat lines of record books and slip into the murky territory of rumor. What had once been celebrated as a patriot's homestead was now whispered about in taverns, murmured in church pews, and passed as hushed warnings from mother to child. To the casual observer, Whitlock's property looked no different from the dozens of other farms that dotted the Albany countryside. But to those who lived close enough to hear the night winds whistle across its fields, the land was heavy with an unease that grew year by year. The first name attached to that unease was Elias Turner, a peddler known throughout the region for his long treks between villages. Elias was not wealthy, but he was trusted. Children recognized the sound of his cart long before he arrived, and mothers greeted him with smiles, trading eggs or fabric scraps for needles, combs, or bits of ribbon. In the autumn of 1795, Elias left Albany with his cart, intending to reach Kinderhook by dusk. His route should have taken him past Whitlock's Lane by mid-afternoon. He never arrived. Days later, his horse and cart were discovered abandoned near the edge of Whitlock's property. Rain slack, goods still neatly arranged. But Elias himself had vanished as though swallowed by the earth. The county authorities recorded the case, but without evidence of foul play, it was set aside. Perhaps Elias had wandered off drunk. Perhaps he had been set upon by bandits. The forest was vast, the river treacherous, and accidents common. Yet in taverns and along fences, the story grew into something less ordinary. People remembered that Whitlock had been seen speaking with Elias a week prior. They remembered how Whitlock's cellar door had groaned open that very evening, lantern light spilling into the darkness. They remembered the sound of his uneven footsteps echoing long after midnight. In the absence of truth, memory bent itself to suspicion. Not long after, another absence deepened the unease. A farmhand, hired by Whitlock for the harvest, was said to have vanished after only a month's work. His name has not survived in record, but folklore preserves him as the boy in the fields. He was young, barely out of adolescence, with dark hair and a laugh that carried across the rows of corn. One evening, as the story goes, he finished his labor, wiped sweat from his brow, and followed Whitlock into the house for supper. He was never seen again. Whitlock later told neighbors that the boy had gone to seek wages in Albany, that he had left without farewell. But no one in town reported his arrival, and no family ever came forward to claim him. Two vanishings close together were enough to stir unease into rumor. By dusk, children who dared to walk past the farmhouse swore they heard moaning beneath the ground, as if the soil itself breathed with sorrow. Others claimed to hear rattling, like chains dragged across stone. They told each other stories of skeletons pacing in the cellar, of shadows that flickered even when no fire was lit. Parents scolded them for spreading nonsense. Yet when those same parents passed Whitlock's fields at night, they walked faster, eyes fixed on the road, ears straining for a sound they hoped would never come. Officially, the authorities dismissed these claims. Missing person reports were filed in both cases, but without bodies, without confessions, without evidence, there was nothing to be done. War veterans vanished, vagrants disappeared, strangers moved on without notice. It was the way of life on the frontier's edge, and yet the whispers refused to die. Folklore is not built in silence, it is built in absence. The less people knew, the more they imagined. Whitlock's habits became raw material for myth-making. His late-night gatherings with cloaked men transformed into secret rituals. His sermons about purity twisted into threats. His cellar, once described as practical and sturdy, became in story a dungeon slick with damp and stained with blood. Every candle flame in his window was said to mark another life extinguished. Every groan of his floorboards was imagined as a cry for mercy. By the turn of the century, Whitlock's name carried an edge of menace. Mothers warned their children, "Do not stray near his property or he will lock you beneath the earth." Farmers whispered that he had traded his revolutionary scars not for peace, but for power. That he fed not just on grain and trade, but on blood. The legends painted him as a man who grew his wealth by harvesting souls as easily as he harvested corn. But psychology offers another reading, one less supernatural but no less revealing. Communities have always sought scapegoats for their fears. A reclusive figure, especially one scarred by war, becomes a canvas onto which anxieties are projected. Whitlock's stiff gait, his distant eyes, his reluctance to mingle at festivals, all became fuel for suspicion. In the fragile years of a young nation, when every disappearance felt like a fracture in the social fabric, it was easier to place blame on the odd, the aloof, the man who preached too loudly of sin and purity. In truth, Whitlock may have been guilty of nothing more than solitude. But solitude, in a fearful community, often resembles guilt. Still, the human mind is not satisfied with absence alone. Folklore fills the void, and so the stories of Whitlock became layered. Half cautionary tale, half whispered accusation. Some swore he was cursed, that the land he purchased carried the weight of ancient burial grounds. Others said he had brought back something from the war, not just scars but shadows, fragments of violence that refused to let him go. There were even those who claimed his cellar was not a prison of his own making, but a shrine, a place where he sought to chain the horrors of his mind, locking them in stone so they could not spill into the world above. The contradictions made the story irresistible. Was Whitlock a predator, luring innocents into his home? Or was he a broken man, punished by rumor, trapped in the prison of his neighbor's suspicion? Both narratives coexisted, and both fueled the unease that spread like smoke through Albany. Then, in 1804, the whispers grew louder still. Whitlock died suddenly, struck down, according to town record, by a seizure in his study. Some said it was justice, that the earth itself had risen against him. Others whispered that he had been silenced before his secrets could be revealed. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. The house, once occupied by a man who divided opinion, now stood empty. And emptiness in folklore is never neutral. Townsfolk avoided the property. Travelers chose longer routes to spare themselves the sight of its red shutters and dark fields. The trapdoor to the cellar, sealed and rusted, became the object of dread and fascination alike. Children dared one another to place a hand on its surface, to feel the cold iron and whisper the names of the missing. Adults crossed themselves when passing the lane, muttering that the ground itself was cursed. The farmhouse was no longer the home of Samuel Whitlock. It was a symbol, a caution, a place where absence spoke louder than presence. The first whispers had done their work. A peddler's disappearance, a farmhand's vanishing, children's tales of moans beneath the soil. These fragments had grown into a legend that the death of Whitlock only amplified. He had been many things: soldier, merchant, benefactor, recluse. But in death, he became something more enduring. A riddle, a shadow, a name spoken in fear. And so the stage was set. When investigators decades later opened the trapdoor and found 12 skeletons chained to stone, it did not feel like revelation. It felt like confirmation. The whispers of 1795 had already told the story. The bones were merely punctuation to a sentence the community had been writing for years. Whitlock's legacy remains suspended between two poles: misunderstood loner or captor of the voiceless. Perhaps he was both. Perhaps the truth lies in the overlap between paranoia and fact, between psychology and superstition. What is certain is this: once whispers take root, they rarely die. They linger, shaping the way a place is remembered, turning a farmhouse into a tomb, a man into a monster, and a community's silence into the loudest sound of all. The year was 1809, and for the first time in nearly half a decade, the Whitlock farmhouse stirred with new life. After Samuel Whitlock's sudden death in 1804, the property had stood empty, its shutters warped by storms, its fields overrun with weeds. The once proud home of a Revolutionary veteran had become a place locals crossed themselves to avoid, a house that carried whispers heavier than its sagging beams. Yet time dulls even the sharpest fears, and when a young family from Albany offered to buy the land, the town, eager to see the property restored, welcomed their decision. At first their work was ordinary. They cleared the overgrown fields, patched leaking roofs, and stripped away the mold that stained the walls. But beneath the surface of the house lay something no repair could cleanse. During renovations, carpenters tearing up warped planks in the main room struck iron, heavy, unyielding, and strangely deliberate. With effort, they unearthed a trapdoor, its hinges rusted and sealed as if meant never to be opened again. The family assumed it was storage. Old houses often hid cellars, sometimes forgotten, sometimes sealed against moisture or rodents. But when crowbars pried the door loose and the boards gave way with a groan, what greeted them was not the scent of dust or grain. It was the thick, sour air of confinement, stagnant and heavy with decay. Lanterns were lowered into the dark, revealing stone walls, slick with damp, and iron rings fixed into the masonry. At first, they thought the rings were for barrels or crates, but then came the unmistakable sight: bones. 12 skeletons lined the chamber, each shackled to the wall by heavy chains. Their positions varied. Some slumped against stone, others collapsed as if mid-struggle. Iron restraints still clamped tight around wrists and ankles. Time had stripped the flesh, but the story written into their bones was far from erased. Several bore fractures that suggested blunt trauma. Others showed grooves near the ankles, signs of repeated strain against shackles. Perhaps most chilling of all were the teeth. Some filed into sharp points, others broken as though from grinding or gnawing. These were not peaceful burials. These were lives extinguished in torment. The discovery swept through Albany like wildfire. Within hours, the farmhouse became a site of pilgrimage, not of reverence, but of horror. Townsfolk gathered at the lane, craning necks to glimpse the cellar, murmuring prayers as though their words might hold back the shadows of what had been unearthed. Newspapers quickly seized upon the tale, dubbing it the basement of silence. Yet the official records told a different story, one of restraint, vagueness, and deliberate omission. County authorities summoned to the site noted the remains but offered little explanation. Their reports made no mention of the filed teeth, no speculation on the fractures, no acknowledgement of the chain still binding bone to stone. Instead, they described the scene as a burial chamber of uncertain origin, suggesting it may have been a family crypt or plague cellar. The townsfolk scoffed. No family would chain its dead. No crypt required shackles, and no plague cellar explained the evidence of starvation written across rib cages bowed and brittle. Doctors called to examine the remains offered interpretations grounded in their era's limited science. They argued the skeletons showed signs of prolonged malnutrition, of confinement so harsh that bones bent and joints locked. They spoke of rickets, of scurvy, of bodies weakened by deprivation rather than violence. But their explanations raised more questions than they answered. Who had confined them? Why 12 and no more? And why chain the dead as well as the living? The clergy had no hesitation in providing their own answers. From pulpits across Albany, priests thundered that the discovery was proof of wickedness, whether human or demonic. Some proclaimed Whitlock himself had been possessed, his obsession with purity a mask for darker appetites. Others warned that the skeletons were not merely the dead, but the damned, their silence echoing the eternal punishment of souls chained in hell. Sermons grew fiery, declaring that sins of the past still echoed in the soil, and that those who dared to dwell in the house risked becoming vessels for its curse. Folklore, of course, wasted no time. The children who had once whispered of moans beneath the earth now claimed vindication. The sounds they'd heard were the dying cries of the chained. Women spoke of shadows seen flitting past windows long abandoned, and men muttered that the Whitlock land had always been cursed, that its stones held memory, and that memory had finally revealed itself. Soon, nightly vigils formed outside the farmhouse. Locals swore that when the wind struck the cellar doors, one could hear rattling chains, faint but insistent, as though the dead still shifted in their bonds. The family who had bought the house found themselves at the center of hysteria. Their intention to renovate and live in the farmhouse faltered under the weight of stares and muttered warnings. Guests refused to enter, workers quit their jobs rather than descend into the cellar, and even neighbors avoided crossing the lane. Fear had made the house untouchable once again, and yet deeper currents stirred. The discovery of the skeletons ignited not only superstition, but also debate among scholars, doctors, and townsfolk alike. Theories multiplied. Some insisted it was evidence of a criminal enterprise. Perhaps Whitlock had been involved in trafficking or illegal imprisonment, hiding victims beneath his floorboards. Others argued it was ritualistic, that the strange markings on the bones and the filed teeth suggested ceremonies far removed from Christian rites. Still others claimed it was nothing more than a grim chapter of forgotten history, perhaps captives of war or vagrants punished under laws now long obsolete. The contrast sharpened. Science saw symptoms of starvation and confinement. Religion saw punishment, either divine or infernal. Folklore saw haunting, proof that the land itself had absorbed cruelty and now demanded remembrance. Each interpretation carried weight, yet none aligned perfectly with the evidence. One particularly unsettling detail further deepened the mystery. Among the 12 skeletons, one was markedly smaller, likely the remains of a child no older than 10. The chains that bound its wrists were crude, as though hastily fitted, and the bones bore fewer fractures, suggesting a shorter period of confinement. Who was the child? Why had they been shackled alongside adults? For villagers, It confirmed the darkest suspicions. That innocence itself had been consumed in the cellar, that no one had been spared Whitlock's obsessions, or whatever force ruled his house. The newspapers, ever eager for sensation, fueled speculation. They printed lurid headlines, painting the discovery as a tale of horror fit for Gothic novels. Illustrations showed gaunt figures chained in darkness, their hollow eyes pleading from beneath the farmhouse floor. But in their sensationalism, they also obscured truth. For every accurate detail, 3 rumors took root, each more extravagant than the last. Some claimed the skeletons were found kneeling, as if in forced prayer. Others insisted their skulls were drilled with holes, evidence of experiments or rituals. The line between fact and fiction blurred until no one could distinguish one from the other. The Whitlock farmhouse became a stage on which the anxieties of a young America played out. In its cellar, people saw reflections of their deepest fears, of unchecked authority, of hidden sins, of the fragile line between faith and madness. The bodies were real, undeniable, but their story refused explanation. They were evidence without context, testimony without words. And so each discipline, science, religion, folklore, interpreted them through its own lens, crafting narratives that revealed as much about the living as about the dead. In the end, the cellar was resealed, though not forgotten. The bones were removed, but their resting place remains uncertain. Some say they were quietly reburied in the churchyard, their chains left behind. Others claim they were taken for study, scattered across universities like artifacts rather than remains. And still others whisper that not all 12 were ever recovered. That one skeleton, perhaps 2, still linger beneath the farmhouse, shackled in silence, waiting for discovery. What is certain is that the discovery of 1809 transformed the Whitlock house forever. No longer merely a home abandoned by a reclusive veteran, it became an icon of dread, a monument to questions without answers. Its basement of silence resonated far beyond Albany, drawing curiosity seekers, scholars, and storytellers alike. And in that resonance, the mystery only deepened. For what are 12 skeletons chained in darkness, if not a riddle carved into bone? Were they victims of human cruelty, punished and forgotten by history? Or were they something more, a sign of evil that transcends explanation, a curse woven into stone and soil? The cellar of Samuel Whitlock leaves us with one undeniable truth. The dead may be silent, but silence itself speaks louder than words. History is often written by those who survive it, but what happens when survival itself becomes suspect? In the case of the Whitlock farmhouse, the story of 12 skeletons chained in the basement might have ended in silence if not for the voices, faint, fragmented, and sometimes contradictory, that emerged in the decades after the discovery. Testimonies, half-whispered memories, and family legends formed a patchwork of accounts that blurred fact and fiction. Were these survivors, witnesses, or simply inheritors of trauma that demanded a narrative? Each voice complicated the puzzle, refusing to let the basement rest in quiet decay. The first of these testimonies came from an elderly woman known in Albany only as Mrs. Krause. By the time the story reached newspapers in the 1830s, she was nearly 70, her hands twisted with arthritis, her voice brittle with age. Yet her words carried a conviction that chilled listeners. She claimed her younger brother Elias had been taken to the Whitlock farm in 1798 after being caught stealing bread. According to her, he was promised work in the fields as punishment and a chance at redemption. He never returned. For years she believed he had fled west, ashamed of his crime. But when the 12 skeletons were discovered in 1809, she said she knew in her bones, that one of them belonged to him. She pointed to a detail no official record had included: a scar above his right brow, a fracture from a childhood fall. "If they had let me see the skulls," she lamented, "I would have found him." "I know I would." Her claim stirred unease. If Elias was among the dead, then the cellar was not merely a chamber of anonymous bones, but a ledger of real, traceable lives. Yet skeptics pointed out inconsistencies. Records showed Elias Krause had been fined, not consigned to labor. Others argued Mrs. Krause's memory was clouded by grief, conflating rumor with fact. Still, her testimony lingered, planted like a seed in public consciousness. Maybe the dead had names after all. Another account surfaced from a farmer named Caleb Warren, who worked neighboring fields in the early 1800s. In his old age, he told his grandchildren of a servant boy once employed at the Whitlock estate. The boy, pale and withdrawn, spoke cryptically of a dark room where voices never stopped crying. Warren admitted he dismissed it as childish fancy at the time, but when the cellar was unearthed, he wondered if those cries had been echoes of the chained. The servant himself disappeared from records, his fate unknown. But Warren's tale became another fragment woven into the tapestry of suspicion. Yet, as often happens with oral histories, contradictions abounded. Some witnesses placed events years too early or too late. Names shifted, sometimes spelled differently, sometimes invented altogether. One woman swore her grandfather had seen wagons delivering prisoners to the farmhouse under cover of night, yet no other testimony corroborated it. Another insisted her aunt worked briefly in the Whitlock household and spoke of children locked away, though her timeline clashed with census records showing no such servants at the time. Memory is fallible, but trauma, whether lived directly or absorbed through rumor, has a way of rewriting itself until legend and experience become indistinguishable. Psychologists studying these accounts centuries later suggest precisely that. They argue the community of Albany, reeling from the shock of the discovery, retrofitted its collective memory to fill the void. In a society already rife with fears of crime, disease, and spiritual corruption, the skeletons provided a focal point, a vessel into which anxieties could be poured. Witnesses may not have lied, but their recollections were shaped by suggestion, by the very human need to impose narrative on chaos. Selective mutism, dissociation, and generational trauma became lenses through which families interpreted the silence of their ancestors. A child refusing to speak might not have been cursed. Perhaps they simply carried the unspoken fear of their lineage. But folklorists resist such reduction. They insist memory, even distorted, contains truth. To dismiss these accounts as psychological inventions is to strip them of their cultural weight. In every whispered testimony, they argue, lies a kernel of reality, whether literal or symbolic. If a woman claimed her brother was chained, maybe he was. If families spoke of a silence curse, perhaps the basement left an imprint too deep to fade. Folklore does not care for exact dates or corroborating documents. It thrives in the spaces history refuses to fill. The silence curse itself deserves attention. By the mid-19th century, several families in Albany and surrounding counties claimed a strange inheritance. Generations of children born mute or plagued by nightmares of rattling chains. Doctors labeled these afflictions congenital defects, speech impediments, or nervous disorders. Priests saw them as divine punishment for sins long concealed. But the families themselves pointed directly to the Whitlock house. They believed the curse was not metaphorical but literal, a punishment passed through bloodlines of those who had once crossed the farmhouse's threshold. Whether these descendants were truly related to victims or simply attached themselves to the story, the curse gave them identity, linking them to a haunting larger than themselves. One particularly chilling case was that of the Halpern family. In 1862, a boy named Jonah Halpern was brought before physicians in Albany. At 10 years old, he had never spoken a word, though his hearing was intact. His parents claimed the muteness ran in their line, tracing back to Jonah's great-grandmother, who had been a girl in the village during the Whitlock years. According to family lore, she once wandered too close to the farmhouse and heard voices beneath the ground. From that day forward, nightmares plagued her, and 2 of her descendants were born mute. Jonah's silence then was not a medical mystery, but the mark of the curse. When doctors examined him, they dismissed superstition and diagnosed congenital aphasia. But to the Halperns, no explanation could erase the weight of inherited silence. Even more eerie were accounts of dreams. Across multiple families, children claimed to see visions of stone walls, chains rattling in darkness, and cries echoing without bodies. Some described the basement in uncanny detail, though they had never set foot in the house. Skeptics argued that such imagery was absorbed from stories passed down in the community, that tales of the Whitlock cellar seeped into young minds like folklore does everywhere. But believers insisted these dreams were evidence of memory beyond memory, the voices of the chained reaching forward in time, ensuring they were never truly forgotten. It is tempting to dismiss all of this as hysteria, as small-town myth fueled by fear and repetition. Yet the consistency of certain details cannot be ignored. Again and again, testimonies described not just chains but sound, voices, moans, the rattling of iron. For survivors, or witnesses, the basement was not silent at all. It lived in the imagination as a place of ceaseless noise, cries too loud for history to suppress. And therein lies the paradox. The cellar was both the basement of silence and a chamber of unending screams, depending on who told the story. By the late 19th century, the farmhouse itself had collapsed into ruin, consumed by ivy and neglect. Yet, even as its physical presence decayed, the testimonies endured. Pilgrims visited the site, scribbling notes of what they felt: unease, dread, a pressing weight on the chest. Local newspapers occasionally revived the story, quoting elderly residents who recalled whispers of neighbors lost, servants vanished, and families cursed. Each telling added new layers, some plausible, some fantastical, but all agreed on one point. The discovery of the skeletons had marked the community forever. Modern psychology frames this phenomenon as collective trauma. Even those who never set foot in the cellar carried its shadow. Trauma, after all, is not limited to the individual. It reverberates through families, through cultures, reshaping memory until pain itself becomes inheritance. Survivors, or those who believed themselves descendants, kept the story alive not because they sought truth, but because silence itself was unbearable. To leave the basement unspoken was to let the chains win, and so the testimonies, fractured and inconsistent though they were, became a form of resistance. Each retelling, each whispered memory, each declaration of a curse ensured that the Whitlock skeletons were not erased by vague official reports or sanitized newspaper accounts. The witnesses gave the dead something official records could not: a voice. Whether that voice was factual or folkloric mattered less than its persistence. Today, scholars sift through these testimonies with caution. Some treat them as valuable oral history, preserving traces of lives otherwise undocumented. Others dismiss them as mythology, warning against confusing trauma with evidence. Yet the very existence of the accounts proves their power. Even ambiguity has weight, and in the story of the Whitlock farmhouse, ambiguity is all that remains. Survivors, witnesses, descendants, the lines between them blur. Were they recalling reality, inventing legends, or carrying inherited grief? Perhaps all at once. But in one respect they shared unity. All agreed the basement marked them forever. Whether through dreams, silence, or whispered family curses, the chains of the Whitlock cellar stretched beyond the grave, binding not only the 12 skeletons, but generations yet to come. 2 centuries after the Whitlock farmhouse yielded its darkest secret, the debate surrounding the chained skeletons has not faded into dust. If anything, time has deepened the fissures, giving rise to interpretations as varied and conflicting as the very bones chained to stone. Historians, skeptics, paranormal investigators, and occult theorists all continue to circle the ruins like moths around a dying flame, each convinced that their explanation holds the closest brush with truth. Yet none of these theories can fully reconcile every fact, every document, every eerie sound that still seems to cling to the cellar. Instead, the ruins exist as a stage where fact and folklore merge into something more enduring, a mystery that refuses resolution. The historian's view is perhaps the most sober. To them, the 12 skeletons are best understood within the brutal realities of late 18th century New York. The Revolutionary War had ended in 1783, but peace did not erase the wounds it left behind. Samuel Whitlock, the farmhouse's builder, was a wealthy merchant who profited from shifting trade routes, yet he was also a man scarred by war and by a culture caught between progress and exploitation. Slavery had not yet been abolished in New York, and indentured servitude was a common practice, often indistinguishable from bondage when debts mounted too high. From this perspective, the chained skeletons may not have been victims of secret rituals at all, but rather enslaved people, runaway laborers, or indentured workers punished into silence. Their anonymity would fit. Those without legal protections could vanish without a trace, and no record would preserve their names. The timing, too, is suggestive. For Albany in the late 1700s was a trading hub where runaway notices filled newspapers and disputes over servitude regularly reached court. To some scholars, Whitlock's basement was simply a dungeon of economic cruelty, one man's grim answer to the defiance of those he saw as property. And yet this interpretation, however plausible, stumbles against its own contradictions. Why, if these were laborers or enslaved persons, were they shackled in such a deliberate and ceremonial way, 12 in number, fixed evenly along the cellar walls? Why the fractures in their bones, the filed teeth, the grooves of restraint that seem more deliberate than mere confinement? Why, too, is there no record, no bill of sale, no runaway advertisement, no legal dispute that hints at Whitlock owning or controlling such a group? Historians are quick to remind us that documents vanish, but the absence here feels deliberate, as though someone ensured silence not only for the dead, but for the memory of them. This silence is what fuels the skeptics. To them, the story of 12 chained skeletons is less about cruelty and more about imagination. They argue that the cellar was never a dungeon at all, but a makeshift burial site during times of epidemic. Albany had its share of disease outbreaks: tuberculosis, smallpox, fever. that claimed lives quickly and with fear. Could it be that the farmhouse's basement was used as a plague pit, its grim contents later sensationalized by panicked townsfolk? When newspapers first reported the discovery in 1809, their accounts already conflicted. One article spoke of bones arranged neatly, another of skeletons scattered in heaps. Some mentioned shackles, others mentioned only rusted farm equipment. To the skeptic's eye, the myth of chained skeletons was less an archaeological truth than a narrative formed by rumor and misreporting. Memories warped, gossip amplified, and a cellar full of disease victims became in time the infamous basement of silence. But this argument too falters under scrutiny. Doctors who examined the remains in 1809 noted grooves in bones consistent with long-term restraint, not natural burial. Fractured wrists, unnatural marks on teeth, and repetitive injuries could not be explained by epidemic deaths. Chains too were verified by multiple witnesses, not merely invented by a reporter's pen. Skeptics dismiss the haunting, but they cannot erase the evidence of confinement etched into the very skeletons. The plague pit theory explains fear but not cruelty. It silences hysteria, but not the unmistakable signs of restraint. Where historians and skeptics leave gaps, paranormal investigators rush in, insisting that the basement still speaks. From the late 20th century onward, countless teams entered the ruins with tape recorders, EMF meters, and thermal cameras. Again and again they claim the silence erupted into sound. Metallic clinks caught on audio where no chains remained. Whispers of children crying out for release. One infamous recording from 1993 carried the words, "Let us out." Faint, yet chilling. Captured in a moment when no human voices were present. Skeptics dismiss these findings as pareidolia, the mind's tendency to impose pattern on static. But believers argue the consistency of the sounds across decades and devices cannot be so easily ignored. Investigators also speak of physical sensations. An unshakable heaviness pressing against the chest, a sudden drop in temperature, or the feeling of unseen hands tugging at clothing. Some groups reported equipment failures when attempting to map the cellar, as if something resisted measurement. To them, the Whitlock skeletons never rested. Their chains bind them still, forcing their cries into any device capable of catching them. And yet this interpretation faces its own questions. If Whitlock's victims truly haunt the place, why do their spirits linger more powerfully than the countless others who suffered in silence throughout history? Wars, massacres, epidemics, all produced victims as nameless and voiceless as these 12. Why does one obscure cellar hold such lasting resonance? Paranormalists respond that trauma leaves echoes, and some wounds cry louder than others. Perhaps Whitlock's victims, silenced so deliberately, scream louder in death than they ever could in life. Most sensational of all, however, are the occult theories, which cast Samuel Whitlock not as a cruel master, but as a ritualist in service of something far darker. His reputation for sermons on purity and rumored midnight gatherings has been reframed by occult historians as the marks of a secret sect. According to this theory, the 12 chained skeletons were not servants or prisoners, but sacrifices. Their deaths were ritual, designed to silence not only their voices but their souls. The number 12 is symbolic. 12 apostles corrupted, 12 zodiac signs inverted, 12 channels of human speech closed forever. Whitlock's fragmented journals contain strange references to binding the restless and cleansing voices. Some interpret these as evidence of rites intended to suppress sin or to harvest silence as a form of spiritual energy. Even the architectural details of the basement, reinforced stone, single entrance, symmetrical spacing, feed this interpretation. The occult theory explains much that the others cannot. The uniformity of 12, the signs of deliberate mutilation, the persistence of haunting described for generations. To believers, Whitlock's cellar was never a dungeon or plague pit, but a temple to silence, built to trap souls as well as bodies. Yet critics argue the case is thin, relying on fragments stretched into symbols. A few cryptic lines in a diary prove little. Still, the imagery is potent, and once imagined it becomes almost impossible to forget. What emerges from these theories is not a clear solution, but a tapestry of contradictions. Each perspective holds part of the truth yet collapses under its own weight. The historian explains the context of servitude but cannot account for the ceremonial details. The skeptic silences hysteria, but not the evidence of cruelty. The paranormalist amplifies the cries of the dead, but cannot explain their persistence. The occultist weaves symbols into ritual but leans on speculation. Perhaps the real answer is not one theory but all of them at once. Perhaps Whitlock's basement absorbed layers of history, first a plague pit, then a prison, finally a haunted relic, each era staining the stone with new horrors until fact and myth fused into one. Trauma may echo through time, and in Albany it may have found its perfect chamber. The ruins now stand overgrown, ivy-clutching stone, the cellar doors sealed yet never silent. Visitors claim to hear chains rattle when the wind shifts. Others swear a faint humming, like a lullaby without words, rises from beneath the soil. Is it imagination, folklore passed down through generations, or something real? The truth has never been pinned down, and perhaps that is the reason the mystery endures. Every theory holds a fragment, incomplete the whole, and so the question passes to those who hear this story today. Was Whitlock's basement the scene of forgotten servitude, where human lives were traded and discarded? Was it merely a burial site, exaggerated into legend by fearful minds? Was it a prison of souls, their voices still rattling through the air? Or was it something darker still, a temple to silence, a place where human cruelty and ritual obsession fused? No one can answer with certainty. Perhaps the only truth left is the silence itself, the refusal of the ruins to confess. And in that silence, every theory, every myth, and every nightmare continues to live. Today, little remains of Samuel Whitlock's farmhouse. The proud red timbers have long collapsed, swallowed by weeds and weather, leaving only fragments of stone foundation clinging to the soil. The cellar, once hidden beneath the wooden floors, is now exposed to the elements, its walls slick with dampness and its air heavy with a chill that lingers even in midsummer. The chains that once bound 12 anonymous skeletons have rusted into flakes, but the silence remains. Visitors who step near the ruins often describe an uncanny pressure in the air, as though the earth itself resists their presence. Some swear they hear faint metallic rattling when the wind cuts across the ground, a sound that should not exist where no iron survives. No definitive evidence has ever been uncovered to explain what happened there. No names of the dead have surfaced, no written confessions, no legal documents that tie Whitlock to crimes. The skeletons, examined briefly in 1809, were later reburied in unmarked graves on the edge of Albany, their identities forever erased from the city's memory. In the absence of proof, interpretation has replaced certainty. Psychologists argue that the legend of the chained dead is not so much history as it is a mirror of trauma. Communities, they say, project fear onto ruins, building stories to make sense of absence and pain. The cellar becomes a canvas for anxiety, its silence transformed into the echoes of cries no one ever truly heard. Priests, however, take another stance. To them, Whitlock's cellar is a warning, a scar of sin left unconfessed. They preach that the nameless 12 were victims of either cruelty or covenant, bound not just by iron but by the refusal of repentance. Their silence, whether chosen or forced, is seen as divine judgment, a reminder that some wounds cannot be hidden beneath stone. Folklorists, by contrast, insist the ruins hum with the residue of voices. They collect testimonies of travelers and ghost hunters who claim to hear whispers or feel the brush of unseen hands. To them, the story persists not because of psychology or theology, but because the dead themselves refuse to let go. And so the mystery of the Whitlock cellar endures. 12 skeletons, 12 chains, 12 unanswered questions. Was Samuel Whitlock a patriot turned monster, using his wealth and power to conceal horrors? Was he a scapegoat for a community eager to explain its own disappearances? Or was he something else entirely, a man driven by beliefs too strange, too dark to survive in daylight? No theory resolves the contradictions. Every explanation leaves gaps. Perhaps the truth died with him in 1804, sealed in the same soil that swallowed his victims. Or perhaps it waits still, shackled in silence beneath the ruins, pressing against the earth with whispers too faint to be caught. Until certainty is found, the cellar remains not just a relic of stone and chain, but a riddle carved into history. A story that invites us to question, to fear, and above all, to listen to the silence.